Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. The Farlam Commission of Inquiry into the Marikana massacre has found against platinum mining company Lonmin on 5 counts and has urged the Department of Mineral Resources to compel the company to provide housing for mine workers. Mining Weekly editor Martin Creamer tells us more. Welcome, Martin.
Thanks, Shannon.
Can you provide an overview of the findings of the Farlam Commission of Inquiry into the Marikana massacre?
It was interesting. I think that the actual institution that has come out of this worst is Lonmin. And they dealt with the counts against and the findings against Lonmin ahead of everything else. So they put that top of the list. Now, if you look at the reason for that, I think you start to realize that these mines are really operating in a 19th century fashion when we've got into the 21st century. And I think that must have been also a factor which influenced the commissioners, because how did this state occur? Why are these people, in such a situation that they're wanting to fight, etc.? They're living away from their families. There's migratory labor. There was this living out allowance, and the living out allowance had caused a lot of aberrations. Instead of people sort of living in housing, which I had seen there earlier, they were really well done, they chose to take the living out allowance because their real interests lie in labour sending areas, far away. That's where their main family is. So they would then just live close to the mine, because then they'd cut down on their costs. They could walk in, they didn't have to take a taxi. So close to the mine fence, they'd stick up a shack. Now, that was all well and good, but a lot of these guys would then be found, washing their overalls, and, a young girl would pass and say, "Gee, what are you doing that for? I can do that for you." And then before you knew what happened, there was a relationship developing there. Then there were little children running around. Now, there was no sanitation, there's no refuse removal, there were just refuse dumps. And people who went there during work time and school time, they would find these little kids playing on the dump. So, the social conditions just deteriorated, and one would have imagined that the mine would have said, okay, this is not working. Let's get down here. We wanted to build you houses. We're willing to build you houses. Under the social and labour plan, we're supposed to build you houses. Now we're going to build you houses, and you may not let those out, because that was another factor. You get a house, you think, gee, this is a wonderful asset. I can draw a revenue stream from this. Why must I stay here? I'm prepared to stay in a shack. Let someone else stay in here and give me the money every month. So that is also something they're going to have to really look at. So you can see that probably the most forcible recommendation of the Farlam Commission is that government must go along to the Department of Mineral Resources, and Mineral Resources must say to Lonmin, you must build those houses. So it's sort of forced delivery of houses, almost getting to the root of the problem, I thought.
And those houses will be family units, so they can bring their families from those labour-sending areas. And
I think this must be the condition, that, if you have a house like that, you don't have a family out in a labour-sending area. They come and live with you, as has been the tradition in South African mining, for some time. I mean, I lived in a mine house. We moved from one house to the other. So that's the way it happened. You moved with your family. And even if there was a bit of a delay between movements, you still got there at some stage.
It does bring other problems, though, because now some of these men do have second families. So I suppose it's a social problem. And
so that, I think, is why, this finding and recommendations sort of go to that heart of that. And of course, there are a lot of other issues, because you could see that the unions, they've been found to be wanting. South African police services have been found to be wanting. And also, a problem, wildcat side of this, is these loose groupings of non-employees that
inciting
it. The provocative songs by the mine workers, all created an atmosphere where people were crossing this line, between what was right and what was wrong. They were going into the area of wrong. They were in the wrong zone. And virtually the unions crossed into that wrong zone. Lonmin has been accused of crossing into that wrong zone. The police have been accused of crossing into the wrong zone. And then this wild card, the loose groupings, they and individuals, they have also been accused of inciting and causing confrontation and conflict. So that mixture, you find they've all gone into the wrong zone. And there's a lot of dust within that wrong zone. And that is why you find that a lot of people are condemning this report, I think, because it's looking at it realistically. and it's saying, look, there was so much dust there that you've all got to sort out this problem. We must never let it happen again. We must learn from this. We must come out of this. This is not what democracy is all about. You should not have been allowed to do that. And maybe that is where, the bell will hit the top and say, hey, in future, there's got to be strong leadership here. You've learnt from Marikana. This can't happen again. And if it does, then heads must roll fast. And people must be taken into custody, because this can be the consequence. You can't stand eyeballing people. You can't allow people to be armed, watching each other, inciting each other, insulting each other. That must end. But of course, the judge also said that perhaps if they had just left them on the copy and waited till the numbers got fewer, or, boredom set in.
Hunger, thirst.
They probably would have had fewer deaths, or maybe no deaths, because they had worked on this encircling with barbed wire, where people would have to leave at a certain point. That is okay for a small crowd, but not for very big crowds. So the tactical option they took was wrong. And therefore I think, they're having now another inquiry into, the National Police Commissioner, Ryhove, and then the Northwest Lieutenant General, who's also been fingered quite severely. I mean, I think she's already quit, so, she's not even around anymore. And I think they're saying that most of the decisions were taken at that level. They're saying it was not taken at executive level. So, the Minister of Police at the time, Nathi Ntetwa, he has really, although they couldn't find anything favourable to say about him, he's largely been exonerated from, the 34 deaths.
What are the Commission's main findings against Lonmin?
Well, Lonmin firstly did not make sure that workers were safeguarded. The feeling was that you should have got in there and made sure workers were safeguarded. You should have taken strong measures to safeguard workers.
The ones that weren't striking and wanted to work.
And the ones that weren't striking to work, you shouldn't have encouraged them to come to work.
When you know the situation.
Because it was too dangerous to encourage them to come to work. So Lonmin possibly had more counts against them than any others. And I suppose, you do go for the company that was responsible for having everyone there, in the first place. And also, the company which was seen to be not following its social labour plan. Because when you actually, apply for your mining license, you undertake to do certain things in terms of the social and labour plan. And they seem to deviate from that on the housing front, which I think was an error.
What about the accusations levelled against Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa?
From the start, these were very thin. I mean, here's a non-executive, director of the company being accused of 34 deaths and
being a murderer.
And being a murderer. I mean, I think they spoiled their case by huge exaggeration. That was unbelievable. So against that background, I think the Commission had no option but to say, look, all these accusations are simply groundless. And at that stage, Cyril still wasn't a politician. I mean, he was a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress, but he wasn't the deputy state president at that stage. He was really a businessman. So they're talking to him in that businessman's capacity. And when you look back, there were 10 security police and police killed in a brutal fashion. Between the 11th and the 15th, there were deaths. We're not talking about the 16th of August now, but ahead of that, there were some gruesome deaths. I mean, people's limbs were shattered, their ears were cut off, and noses cut off, lips cut off. I mean, it was really, really terrible.
Disturbing.
And I think it was at that point, that as a non-executive director, he said, please, we must stop this. He's not saying we must kill people. He's saying we mustn't kill people. Make sure we don't kill people. So to turn that around and to say that he's responsible for 34, I mean, it really, you could see that there was no ways that any logic was going to prevail with that. And, it was found to be groundless, and he was totally exonerated.
What for you were the most surprising or notable recommendations from the Commission?
Well, I think the most direct and forceful one, and it seemed to be the most clear-cut one, because, when it came to the South African police services, you were not fitted with an instruction except to say, have another inquiry. So you have, one inquiry following another inquiry to see how these people should have acted. There's also, of course, a lot of recommendations that in future, all the vehicles and all the helicopters have video so that you can see what's going on continuously.
Which is so obvious.
Yes, there's also that situation of the scene 2, which is horrific, where, scene 1, the whole of South Africa and the world saw on television. And if it had ended there, it would have been terrible enough. But what, the world did not see and what we did not see was scene 2, when fleeing strikers and demonstrators were pursued, in armoured vehicles. There were no cameras, but the indications are some were people were run over. There are indications that some defenceless people who are really hiding, were murdered. And I think that, the widows and orphans in those circumstances are going to have massive claims. Not to say that the widows and orphans of the people who were shot in scene 1 won't have claims, but I think those claims probably are not going to be as huge as those in scene 2. And so we've got this notable recommendation, really the one that stands out above the others because it's so crisp and direct, is that build houses, Lonmin. You're not going to get away with giving an undertaking in a social and labour plan and not doing it because what the consequences, the unintended consequences of that, seem to be at the root of all the problems. And you want to get to the root of these problems. And hopefully this particular commission will make sure that, policing changes. It becomes far more sophisticated, using the best techniques, best practice. They called for world best practice. So those police must be equipped. They must really be trained. And I think that we've got to see that something good comes out of this. And it is symbolic that it comes out really today, which is the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Charter. The people of went to Kliptown in 1955. And I was often taken to Kliptown as a journalist because the people didn't want you to forget that. And they would tell you, this is where we signed the Freedom Charter. They would always want to show you this because they felt that, during the apartheid years, this wasn't being recognized. So often journalists were taken there, myself included, to emphasize that this is the foundation on when we want to build, the democratic South Africa. Of course, it did come through in 1994, and we see people now sitting at Kliptown, the very site, and there's a conference centre now. It's so different. There's the Soweto Hotel and Conference Centre. They're all in there, and they're all discussing at a different level, which is itself an indication of how far South Africa has progressed. And now they're saying, some of the mythical sanctities of that Freedom Charter must be reviewed, because all very well saying that we must nationalise the banks, but we're never going to nationalise the banks. So why keep that in? It's a moving document, and they want to now update it. And I think that will really be wonderful in this information age, where people need to get access to correct information. They need not go back to situations and see them in a different context, where they were told to nationalise the mines, which is really impossible. Already, we have become, and Marikana is one of the causes, we've become a mineral-rich country that is mining poor. We are mining poor at the moment. And, is this good for future generations? We should really be laying a proper foundation now in mining, because that is the key generator of wealth, along, with obviously the associated activities around mining and all the other spin-offs. But it is really true that 8 out of 10 people in South Africa are just touched by mining, whether they like it or not. And so now is the time to make sure that we set the ground rules for the unions. If a situation occurs where people are taunting the others, they must be separated, and there must be equipment to move them apart, proper equipment, so that they don't cause a conflict. If they are carrying arms, they must be disarmed. That must be illegal. That act, there's the act in place. it's got to be enforced. You can't have people defying the law in these situations, because we can see the consequences. So they've got to be modernized. The whole thing has got to be modernized, and perhaps the very Freedom Charter on which a lot of the thinking took place also needs to modernize. And it's good to hear those voices coming out of Soweto at the moment, coming out of Kliptown, saying, let's modernize this Freedom Charter so that it becomes fully relevant to our people in this information age.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Great pleasure, Shannon.
That's it for today. Join us again next week for more news analysis on South Africa's mining industry.